Welcome, everyone, to the 140th episode of the OLA Adult Ed Faith Formation Weekly Gospel Podcasts, where Max is behind the camera, and he has been since day one. I'm in front of the camera. We are on the campus of St. Bonaventure High School. This is the 6th Sunday of Ordinary Time, the last Sunday before we go into the Lenten season. And we're in the Gospel of Matthew because this is a year of Matthew. We're in the Sermon on the Mount, and our passage comes from Matthew 5, verses 17 to 37. I can recall the Sermon on the Mount. Matthew records it in chapters 5, 6, and 7. Luke also records it. He has a shorter rendering of it. But we're in the Gospel of Matthew, so the Sermon on the Mount covers chapters 5, 6, and 7. We are at the beginning of chapter 5, the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount. Now, to kind of set the context and set the scene, Jesus has begun the Sermon on the Mount with the Beatitudes, which we talked about last Sunday's Gospel podcast. He then moves into talking about them and us being salt and light. And then he moves into these verses that form this week's gospel passage, 17 to 37. And these verses are called the Great Antitheses because he's going to launch into a series of statements where he indicates, you have heard that it was said, but I say to you. So he's kind of creating an antithesis for each of these things, hence the title, The Great Antitheses. Now, let's start with something Jesus says at the beginning, because what he says at the very beginning of the Great Antitheses sets the theme, sets the tone, really sets the structure for the rest of the 20 verses we're going to be looking at today. And again, as we always say, we want to be mindful of context. We want to watch, listen, and read closely because words have meaning. And these are Jesus' words. These are the words he uses to start this portion of the Sermon on the Mount. Verse 17, Jesus' words, "Do not imagine that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have come not to abolish, but to complete them or to fulfill them." All right? So that's his statement. He hasn't come to abolish the law. He comes to complete it and fulfill it. And one way he does that is by issuing these great antitheses that covered in next 20 verses. So verses 18 to 37 all demonstrate what he says in verse 17 to start out with, that he's come not to abolish the law, but to complete and fulfill it. Now, the law he's talking about is the Mosaic law, the law of Moses, the law that they operated under the Old Testament. And this law was very focused on externals. The people, rightly so, were concerned about being pure, not being defiled, so that they were in a position to be able to go into the temple and offer sacrifice and worship God. Being pure, being undefiled was a huge, huge issue. Now, back then, they thought the source of defilement came from the outside, okay? That's why they had certain dietary laws, foods that they could eat, foods that they couldn't eat. That's why they had all the purity laws, where they had to purify themselves before they ate. They had to purify their vessels and their utensils before they ate, okay? Because non-defilement and purity was such a big issue, they had many laws, many rituals, many traditions to help them stay pure and stay undefiled. But it was all focused on the externals because they thought defilement came from outside. Jesus, okay, indicates that's not the case. He says that what defiles a man comes from the inside. It comes from his heart. So when Jesus, in his Sermon on the Mount, when he lays out the new law, the law of the gospel, he's trying to move the people away from thinking that defilement comes from the outside to a position where they understand that defilement actually comes from inside. It comes from your heart. That's what defiles you, not something from the outside. Now, we indicated in a previous podcast that one of the reasons Jesus gives this sermon and gives it on the Mount is because he's trying to evoke images of Moses, in that Jesus now is the new and greater Moses. So just like Moses went up Mount Sinai, got the old law from God, and then came down and gave it to the people, Jesus now is going up another mountain. And he is God, and he is going to give the new law, the law of the gospel, to the people. And in doing that, Jesus becomes the new and greater Moses. And he starts out these particular verses by saying, look, what I'm going to say to you, all right, in this sermon, not only what I said to you with the Beatitudes, not only what I'm going to say to you now, but indeed what I'm going to say to you in the entire Sermon on the Mount, okay? I'm not abolishing the old law. Don't think that. What I'm doing is I'm completing it and fulfilling it. And the way he completes and fulfills the old law is he indicates that this new law, the law of the gospel, talks about the heart, not just the externals. So moving them from externals to matters of the heart, that's how he's completing and fulfilling the old law. The new law is a law of the heart. The old law was a law of externals. So he indicates that right from the get-go, and then he indicates to them some of the ways in which he's going to complete and fulfill the old law. And it's interesting to note, now again, we asked a question. Jesus could have picked any topics to indicate how he's going to complete and fulfill the old law. Okay, he could have picked any number of topics. But notice the topics he picks. He talks about killing, right? He talks about committing adultery. He talks about divorce. He talks about oath-taking. He talks about judging. He talks about loving your enemies as well as your neighbors. And we've got to ask the question, of all of the topics he could have talked about to show how the new law of the gospel, being a law of the heart, fulfills the old law, being a law of externals, of all the topics he could have chosen to use as an examples, we got to ask ourselves the question, why these particular ones? And it's kind of interesting. I don't know if you've ever really realized that, but in picking these topics, right, look at how closely they line up with a lot of the 10 Commandments. Coincidence? No, because we already know there's no coincidences when it comes to God. Let's just go through them and kind of consider them and which commandment they kind of line up with. The first one, he says, you have heard you have heard that it was said, you shall not kill. But I say to you, and then he goes on and says, anyone that's angry, etc., etc., etc. So the first example of how the new law of the gospel fulfills the old law of externals, the first example he uses is killing. Now again, the fifth commandment talks about killing. So the first thing he talks about here lines up with commandment number 5. And even just as interesting, if you go into the Catechism of the Catholic Church, into the section where it talks about the 10 Commandments, when we get to the 5th commandment, okay, it talks about all the different forms and levels of killing, premeditated murder, obviously. But if we look at that particular commandment, as the Catechism rolls it out, it treats premeditated murder, intentional homicide, abortion, it talks about euthanasia, and then it talks about anger and hatred and vengefulness. And you might say, why would the Catechism talk about anger, hatred, and vengefulness under the commandment, thou shalt not kill? Because those things left unchecked in the human heart could potentially lead to killing, could potentially lead to murder, okay? So again, it's a matter of the heart. So when the Catechism brings out all these other things that lead to killing, the Catechism is pointing out the new law, the law of the gospel, as being a law of the heart, not just externals. The second thing he mentions, you have heard that it was said, you should not commit adultery. And then he goes on to say, anyone who lusts after a woman in his heart has committed adultery in his heart. So again, he's getting below the surface to the heart of the matter, right? Because you're thinking, okay, if an individual is lusting after a woman, that could potentially lead to that person committing adultery. And interestingly enough, adultery and divorce, which he mentions right after this, that lines up with the sixth commandment. So if you look at it as we'll kind of look at it from this perspective, if you look at these great antitheses and we just focus on why Jesus picks these particular areas to demonstrate how the new law is a law of the heart rather than just externals, he picks them because they are great examples of how things you nurture in your heart could lead to bigger things, and also because they line up so nicely with the Ten Commandments. Let's take the next one. You have heard that it was said, be careful about taking oaths, and let your yes be yes and your no be no. Again, he's getting to the point of, look, in order to tell the truth, you shouldn't have to take an oath to do so. It should be in your heart to speak the truth. It should be in your heart to avoid lies, right? So, if I'm speaking words of truth, it's because truth is in my heart. If I'm speaking words of lies, it's because lies are in my heart, right? So the source of all of these things, the seedbed, if you will, of all of these things is the heart. And interestingly enough, being truthful in your speech, not being deceptive in your speech, that lines up with the eighth commandment, thou shalt not bear false witness. So if you look at these once again, they're all excellent examples of what he's saying. The genesis, the source, the seedbed of all of these things start in one's heart. And also, they line up with the Ten Commandments, right? Then he talks about loving your enemies and not just your neighbor, right? And again, first commandment, love the Lord your God, right? And love your neighbor as yourself. And again, if I'm going to love somebody, what is the source? What is the seedbed of that love, all right? It's my heart. So Jesus is trying to hammer home the point here to his disciples who are on the mountain with him, to the crowds that had gathered, and by extension us, that the new law, the law of the gospel, the law that he came to bring, all right, first of all, it fulfills and completes the old law in that it goes beyond just the externals and gets behind those externals into the source and seedbed of those externals, which is the heart. And he's indicating things like killing, things like adultery, things like lying, things like hating people, right? Things like falsely judging people, all right? Those are all outward actions, okay, that are manifested externally. But they all have a source a genesis, a seedbed from which they manifest themselves, and that's the heart. So the new law, the law of the gospel, goes beyond the surface, beyond the externals, and gets to literally, we could say, the heart of the matter, to coin a phrase, in that all of these external things, all of our actions, the engine that drives them is the human heart. And that's where defilement begins if that's the state of your heart, right? And it's no coincidence that the topics he chooses, the areas he chooses, match up nicely with the 10 commandments, right? Killing, right? Commandment 5. Adultery and divorce, Commandment 6. Oath-taking and speaking truthfully, Commandment 8. Loving your enemies as well as your neighbor, Commandment number 1. So, again, the Sermon on the Mount, the new law that Jesus is giving on this mountain, goes above and beyond the old law that Moses brought from Mount Sinai, in that it goes inside the person and indicates to him the importance of having a pure heart. Okay? One other thing we should mention, when he talks about adultery and divorce, and when the sixth commandment talks about adultery and divorce, all right? If you look at the Catechism's treatment of the sixth commandment, it also goes on to talk about such things as modesty, purity in dress, chastity. Because all of those things, okay, if you're immodest, if you're impure, all right, if you're not chaste, depending on your state in life. If you're not those things, again, they could lead to lust, which in turn could lead to adultery, all right? So he's trying to kind of build that bridge from what's in your heart is manifested by your actions. So he's focusing people, the externals, that's the end result. What you've got to consider is the beginning of that end result, which is what's in the human heart. All right? So, again, not a verse-by-verse treatment because there's 20 verses and that's beyond the scope of this podcast. But hopefully what I've been able to bring out is how his law, the law of the gospel, fulfills and completes the old law, number one, by directing it away from externals just to the heart, and kind of an idea of why he chose these particular areas as examples of that. Because they're all areas that begin in the human heart and end up being these actions, and they also are areas that line up with the 10 Commandments. So maybe a perspective we haven't taken before, that we can use as kind of a background and a backdrop. So when we hear this gospel proclaimed on Sunday, we can, as we hear the actual verses, we can lay them against the background and backdrop that we developed in this podcast. At least that's the hope. So with that said, I will bring episode 141 to a close. As always, have a great and blessed sixth Sunday of Ordinary Time, and have a great and blessed Lenten season 2026. Until next time, I'm Charles Merritt. Take care and God bless.